Good morning and Chanukah, Rosh Chodesh Tov. So we're in Beis, Volume 2, page 1159 at the bottom. And the Rebbe Rashab is dissecting the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra now, after a long discussion of the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti. The Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra in simple English is referring to the interface between the divine and existence as it relates to existence. So it's called the Ayin, the so-called divine energy, which is called Ayin now because it is not of the same substance as the Yesh, as creation, as existence is, and it's not understood by us. So we call it Ayin. So the word Ayin can mean nullified, can mean complete selflessness. In this case, Ayin here means that it is beyond us. So it's essentially the divine energy, the creative divine energy that's beyond us, beyond meaning us as existence. In contrast to the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, where there, its entire personality, its entire identity is about selflessness. Complete selflessness meaning complete nullified in the presence of the divine, and it introduces the concept of bittul to the whole cosmic order and the whole system. So the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. Now the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, he says, is considered a moker. This you could already call a source because it relates to and engages with and is focused on the product, which is the production of the creation. And yet it's still ha'ara. It's still ur. But he calls it as a ha'ara of a ha'ara. It's a reflection of a reflection, and he defined that as being a ha'ara nivdelis, which means, as in contrast to a ha'ara like the Shem Havaya, which is also a name. It's also a reflection, not the core etzem, but we call it Shema etzem because it's a reflection of the core essence. Whereas in this case, it's a reflection of the reflection because it's as that divine energy relates to and creates existence. And he used other words as well, Shem Etzem, Shem HaPu'ula, the name Pu'ula, the describing his the function that he's involved with. And then he introduced, summing this up, Malchus. That this where this fits into the map, in the geography, in the order, especially when we're talking in Atzilus, it's Malchus. Because Malchus is, he says, a koyach nivdal. A melech is not the core of the essence of the individual. It's something that does not, we don't know what his individuality is like, but he is the melech. So it's the lowest level in Atzilus. And that will become the creative energy through which Bria, Sir Asir, the lower worlds will be created. Okay. And the example for that was Dibur. This is how the divine energy manifests in language, in words, Dibur, speech, God's speech, which is already relating to another, even though it's still connected with him. And this Dibur is explained is what we call something that's already nivdal, something apart. Now, not only are the letters and the kelim of Malchus nivdal, but also the energy, because when you're imparting, let's say, intelligence, the intelligence too is now being communicated to something outside of the one that is teaching or communicating. Okay. The last thing we learned is summing this up. He says, V'hagam. You just said it's a nivdal, it's removed, somewhat separate from. Isn't every agam, though that over koyach halaki, even the lowest koyach halaki is still a divine faculty. And especially one that's involved with creation process. We're not talking about some superficial or incidental activity. It's an activity that's involved in creation. So it's true that compared to the etzem of the divine, creation is only an external reflection, but it's still a reflection of the divine energy that's invested in it. So he explains now, he introduced that so how do you call nivdal, ha'ara nivdalis? So he explains that in Devekus, which is the opposite of nivdelis. Dveikus means attached, connected. There are two ways to. Oyer is actually its whole personality, its whole identity, its whole being is all about being attached and reflecting its source. The Oyer Aleki that manifests in creation, which is also davuk, it has to be connected, but there the dveikus is not, the focus is not the connection, the focus is on the renewal of it. Because you're trying to create something, you want to create something that will have maintained vitality and be something that is alive. Therefore, it's linked to the divine energy. So therefore, the koyach haleki, even though it is a divine energy, even though it's involved with creation, which means something outside of the core, but it's always connected to the pipe is always connected back to the source where this energy is being renewed. So the focus is more what we call hischachus, and not the words were schachus, loy b'bchinas dveikus mamish. Because dveikus, I explained at least dveikus mamish means you can explain several ways. The most basic way to explain it is the focus is not on the dveikus. The focus is on the hischachus, on the renewal. Another way you can explain it is that the oyer, because all it is connection, so it's mamish dveikus. That's what its role is. The koyach haleki Malchus that invests itself, the 10, the Asara Ma'amoros Nivra Elam, though they also are part of the divine energy, but you can't call them dveikus mamish because they're not reflecting the core, they're reflecting a function of the core. Like we spoke the difference between Yesh and Oyer. Oyer reflects Atzmus. Yesh reflects what Atzmus wants, but it's not a reflection of Atzmus. So the koyach haleki, which of course is not Yesh, is the one that creates the Yesh and tailors toward it. Like we said, Asara Ma'amoros, you hear Oyer, you hear Rakia. It's the Havdalah, it's you can't call it dveikus mamish because it's not the natural flow or the natural reflection without any what's the word I want to use, without any buffer, without any in between. Once you say the Eibishter is going to Asara Ma'amoros, you're already saying he's going, the divine energy is already manifesting in a level that's not just pure dveikus, because it's relating now to the existence and the structure of existence. Okay. But then he said one more thing. Like we said before, that from the Geras HaKedesh, that the Savas comes not just from the Asara Ma'amoros, it's connected to the Oyer, which is Davuk, which is fully attached to its source. So here he said, Hini be'emes, because real truth, in truth, creation comes from there. That's Oyer Shu Davuk. But the process, and this is where he goes a little deeper into the whole thing. So in other words, there's two things going on here. There's the process of creation, which also is linked to its source, but there's something else here. The Oyer Aleki, the divine energy that relates to existence, is also traveling through the higher level of Oyer that's completely attached and connected to its source. And this is where he brings for the proof from Vayitzavim, the Maimer, that the order to create Biyah, so you see here, back to the struggle with the interface, you see the constant dance and the constant effort to create the balances. Is it divine? Is it relate to existence? And he keeps going back and forth, back and forth. So this shouldn't surprise anyone learning Ayin Beis, because this is constant, because that's how you try to really find that delicate place, that thin line. So you see here that it's divine energy. First he called it separate, a reflection that's like separated. Then he said, but how could you say it's separate? It's a divine force, koyach haleki. So he calls it his chachas. Then he goes in further, and it's still connected to the higher level. And yet the process goes through this step, and to the point that the koyach haleki now relates to misper, to a number, which is definitely structure. And that's more or less where we stopped. Okay. I just wanted to sum it up because, as I said yesterday, it's very dense. All this is concentrated in just a page, but it's all coming together really, as I explained, what he's speaking about many pages back, Tafresh Samach, what did I say? Tafresh Pei, 660. 660. What did I say? 1 second. Let me just see it again. Well, the whole subject matter really began 665 or something like that. I'll just give you the exact page. I don't want to just guess. Yeah, 664. That's where it started. But some of what we learned right now, if you want more discussion on it, you go to page, a minute. I gave it yesterday. 1 second. Yeah, 686 is where it speaks the difference between Oyer, what's completely attached, and the Oyer as it relates to existence. Now, the mashal of Dibur is vital here because it makes it easier for us to understand. If you're going to prepare a speech, or you're going to prepare something you're going to present to others, we know it doesn't just come automatic. There's a process that begins all the way in your mind, in your thought process, and as you move along, you're moving closer to communicating it. So it's not difficult to envision at least two levels here, if not more. You have your machshava, your thought, which is all still internal, relatively speaking, even though he said that's also relative to your etzem, and the other keches, it's more external, but it's internal. You have how you start preparing like dibur shebe machshava. Start preparing the exact phrases and words you're going to use. And then there's the machshava shebe dibur, and there's the dibur shebe dibur. When you begin speaking to another, it's informed by the thoughts that came before it. So if you apply that lamaila, the same idea, like we learned a lot about lifnei tzimtzum even on that level. Even though there's nothing in any way tangible, it's all within the divine energy. But the point being that there's a stage where it's still more internal and connected to you and what you want to convey. And then there's how you put it into words that another can understand, expressing it that way. Or for that matter, a business plan or building something. It always begins with something internal. Then you flesh it out, develop it into a full-fledged plan and structure. So essentially what he's saying here, just to put it in very balabatisha terms, that in the divine energy itself, there's also those two aspects. There's one that reflects a lot more what God wants, the kavanah, the vision for the structure of existence. And then there's the actual details connected to the actual structure. Now, this is something we've learned throughout. It's just coming back now. He's putting it all together into this ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. Okay. Let me just address one more thing. I got a text, someone who's following our classes here, regarding Malchus. The question was like this. You mentioned that Malchus, the Rebbe Rashab says Malchus is a koyach nivdal. It's the lowest koyach. It's the 10th of the 10 spheres. So clearly it's the lowest level. And he called it nivdal. A king, the word being a king is not reflective of his core. It's reflective of his more something that he relates to another. So he said, didn't we also learn, this is the question, that hisnasus atzmis, when you talk about a true king, a leader, a rebbe, and so on, Malchus is not an external thing. The person has a personality. Very personality is one that's meshichma umayla gavoyim kalam. He is a leader by the etzem. So leadership reflects his etzem, not just some type of like external superficial activity. So how does that reconcile with what he says here? So the answer of Chassidus is, that's true. If you're talking from the level of Etzem, Malchus, we know, actually, even though it's the lowest sphere, but it connects to Kesed and it connects all the way to the Etzem. Because Malchus is what the Eibishter wants. Being a Melech is coming from his Atzmius. But if you're talking Giluyim, in Giluyim, which is what he's addressing here, in Giluyim, Malchus has the least revealed, because you don't see in the Malach, in the word that he's a king or a leader or a Rebbe, his whole identity. So though it's coming from his core essence, and this is what he's made to be, Moshe Rabbeinu was born to be a leader. It wasn't just a thing he picked up at some point. Same thing, every Melech, he b'shur Melech. So the Malchus comes from the Etzem, it's true. But in Giluyim, which is what we're discussing here, because remember the Ayin is Oyer. Oyer is Giluyim. So on the level of Oyer, the Oyer that reflects the essence of the king, meaning who he is and his personality, is far higher. The Oyer of the Oyer within Malchus conceals and doesn't really reveal to you what he's really like in the Giluyim. So it's a good question and just puts things into context. Obviously, the goal is to combine both. What you want to have, it's like we say, the sun and the moon. The sun is Zah. The moon is Malchus. So which one is greater? If you took Giluyim, of course the sun is higher. Its light is stronger. It generates light. It's a mashpia. The Levana, on the other hand, is a makabel. The Levana doesn't have eles la megarma klum. It doesn't have anything of its own. It doesn't have light of its own. It's reflecting the sunlight. But if you took the Shadish Ayin, in the Shadish, the Levana is rooted much higher than the Shemesh. Sral Daimon the Levana, Maina the Levana. So the Levana, in its own so-called lack of Giluyim, is a sense that Etzem is embedded there. This goes back to our discussions in previous classes, what the Etzem and Ispashtus, Etzem and Giluyim. So I don't need to elaborate more, I just wanted to put that into context. Here we're talking about Ayin, we're talking about the process of Giluyim, whether it's Bittul, whether it's creation process, whether it's Avodah, how we climb the ladder, we go through all these steps. So we're talking about revealing Elikus or concealing Elikus for that matter. And that's where this comes into play in this fashion here. Okay, good. Before I continue, anybody has any questions? I'm on the bottom of page 1159. I'll continue reading now, unless you have something to ask. Okay. So just looking up in the beginning of the whole thing, discussion of the Ayin. This is what I wanted. I wanted to just, 1 second. Okay, so we continue on. The bottom, I'm reading now 3 lines from the bottom of page 1159. And it's explained elsewhere. He's explaining this level of, again, the divine energy, what was called earlier, Elokai, though he hasn't used those terms here, but it's exactly what he said earlier back in the 6 pages 606 in the 600s that I mentioned. He said this ha'ara, that is elsewhere it's explained, shazehu, that this level, this level is a ha'ara hanimsheches ma'yichud de'ihu v'garmuhi. Okay, so he's introducing yet another phrase, but again, this is not new. If you go back in Ayin Beis, you'll find a lot of discussion on Iyur v'garmui and Iyur v'chayu. So let me first say what those words mean before I read on. So the Zohar says, talking about Atzilus, that Iyur v'chayu echad, Iyur v'garmui. Actually, no. Where the lashon of Iyur garmui v'garmui echad is from Tikkun Ezer, I think. Yes, the Zohar. Good. So what does that mean? Ihu, you, and chayu. So what's chayu? Chayu literally means you and your chayis. So there's actually two interpretations we learned earlier. The Arizal teaches chayui moichin, and iyu v'garmuhi. Garmuhi is like, is actually technically means, garmuhi means the skeleton, bones. So you and your so-called energy, think of chayui like neshama. You're one with your neshama and you're one with your guf. Not guf, obviously a physical guf, means with your structure. So the Arizal teaches chayui v'garmuhi, which is not really relevant. I'm just saying it for the record. Moichin and midas. The Alter Rebbe in Gersa Kedah Siman Chof, the famous Siman Chof that he referred to earlier, teaches is Eiris and Kalim. That you, with your Eiris, Chayui, the Eiris are one. You and your Garmui and your Kalim are one. So in other words, you are one with the energy, you're one with the instruments. To put it in simple English, like an author writes a book, he's one with the ideas, which is the Eir, and he's one with the words that he's using. The truth is, by author, human author, he's not one with them because he's separate from the words, he's separate from the ideas. But when we talk about an Atzilus compared to Elikus, to the divine, it's all one. So Chassidus asked the question, so why doesn't it just to shorten the phrase, it should say, Iyu v'chayui v'garmui chad? Why do you have Iyu v'chayui chad, Iyu v'garmui chad? So Chassidus explains there's two different yichudim. If the Eiris and Kalim were united the same way, you wouldn't need to say it in two phrases. You just say you and your energies, or your Eiris and your Kalim are one. So therefore, we learn from this that there's two different types of yichud: the yichud of the Eiris and the yichud of the Kalim. So the Rebbe Rashab is saying what we're discussing now is the yichud in the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, the yichud of the Kalim Telakus. Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti is Eir, of course, is the yichud of the Eir. So he's saying somewhere elsewhere, it's explained that this level that we're discussing now, which is what? The level of how the divine energy is relating to existence, which he called before separate, nivdelis. And then he explained it's not completely nivdel, obviously, because it's receiving the energy. He says this is, this comes from the yichud of ihu v'garmuhi. So we say ihu v'garmuhi chad, there's a yichud. So in other words, analyzing the difference between how God relates to his energies, which are essentially his expression and his reflection, and how God relates to his kalim, the instruments, or actually the structure of that, of what he wants to create. And we know both are there because we need both. So even though the muscle from a human being is not complete, it still helps us. Because if you were to ask, let's say, an architect or an artist, tell me, what is the vision for the piece of art that you're creating? So the vision is far closer to the artist than is the actual instruments and the structure of the painting. Because the vision is what he wants to really communicate, the spirit, the sentiment, the feeling. That's the Eir. If you asked him, so, and what's your relationship with the actual way that you're going to convey this vision? Like the letters on a page. In this case, the images on the canvas and the details. He'll say, it's also part of my plan, obviously. But now I'm focusing on the details to make sure it's in place and it's aligned with the vision. And you need both. So essentially what I'm translating now, Eir as vision and Kalim as the structure. Similar to when Moshe and Betzalel, Moshe tells Betzalel, build me a mishkan. The Eibishter says, build me a mishkan and I will reside among you. And then he starts enumerating the Aron, build the ark, build the menorah, the mizbeach, etc. And then he gets to the structure, the walls, the yerias, and the structure of the mishkan. So Betzalel says to Moshe, that's not the way of the world. It's not minhag elam. First you build a structure, then you bring the furniture into it. You don't build the furniture and then you have nowhere to put it. And Moshe says, you're right. So of course, what is going on here? Moshe didn't understand that. It's a practical thing. Because Moshe was the vision, he's the Eir. He's conveying what the Eibishter wants. The Eibishter is not, the Yerias is where, which houses, it houses the Mishkan. The Eibishter wants V'shachanti b'seicham. So Moshe starts, how do you get to V'shachanti b'seicham? You need an Aron. or according to the Rambam on Mizbeach. But bottom line, the Aveda, the Migdash is the Kavanah. But you can't do an Aveda without building it. So you have to build the walls and so on. So Betzalel was talking about the structure, the Kalim. Kalim here, not the Kalim in the Mishkan. Kalim meaning the structure of the Mishkan. And Moshe was talking about the vision of the Mishkan, which is the Kavanah, the Eir Shabazah, and we need both in this world. That's how you do the two. So just to give it a little more, some concrete language to understand these abstract ideas. So now obviously all this is a limited mashal, it's a limited example, but now you can apply it. Let's move it back to the way the Eibishter. There's the Yichud, what he's saying now, the Yichud, the Iyuv v'Garmui. This ha'ara, in other words, the order that is reflected, the second level, is the Yichud of Garmui. Ava b'chinas ihu, ava b'chinas ihu be'etzem. So in other words, when you say ihu v'Garmui chad, you're talking about how the divine energy is connecting to the kalim, to the structure. But what about Iyu be'etzem? You, God Himself. Be'etzem shu ikra mahave, the primary force of creation. Like we said, the primary force of creation comes from Iyu. Only the Eibishter could create. Ikra mahave, shu ikra mahave, who call Yachul, shemamen nimshach lahaves hayesh hagashmi. Zeu bli misper. He's called Yachul, and that's why he's capable of creating. From him comes the power to create Yesh Gashmi, like he says in the Geras HaKedesh. This is the level Bli Mispar, which of course is the contrast to what he said a line before, Veitzavim, from the mind of Veitzavim, Mispar. So in other words, I'll read on in a minute to explain it, but let me put this into right context here. In other words, what you're dealing with here is two sides. There's the creator himself, the Ihu. That, of course, is coming from the highest levels. And that's a level you can't call mispar. You can't call it. The vision of creation, the structure is insignificant, really. I may say insignificant. He wants it, but it's not the focus. The focus there is the kavana, atzmis, in the whole process. So that you can't call mispar. It's bli mispar. It's beyond the structure of a hierarchy of numbers and so on. But from there, he wants to create. So the actual, like you said before, his savas b'peil is through the oiris and through the kalim. And when it comes to the kalim, he's saying, there, it's in a state of mispar. So in other words, you go back to the root, it's beyond structure. But then as it manifests in the levels that relate to actual creation, it's the unity with, in the mashal that I gave, like the artist using instruments. You can't compare the instruments and their relationship with the artist to the relationship of the oiris or to the artist as he is in his core essence. And yet, he's still using these instruments. They're an extension of him. The Eibishter Basara Mamaris Nivra Elom. It's Mamaris of God's Maimer. He didn't delegate that. But Dvar Hashem, it's God's words. So the words are connected to him, but they're relating already to the structure. When you talk about the Ihu itself, you're talking about the power of creation itself, which comes from the source, from the essence. Vahainu, this means that this is a ha'ara, the oir, in other words, that's conveying the kol yachol, the power of God to create. That's a ha'ara in a state of dveikus, the higher level. Aval ha'oir, next page, 1160. Aval ha'oir sheb'chinas islapshus be'esis v'kelim de Malchus, the lower level. The oir, as it manifests and gets enclosed in the letters and the containers of Malchus. Shezeu b'chinas ha'oris iyu ha'misyachid in garmuhi. This is not iyu on its own, iyu v'chayuhi, on its own with oir. But this is already the ha'ara. The ha'ara of iyu meaning guyu, talking about the Eibishter. Ha'misyachid, which connects, which unites, im garmuhi, with the structure, with the kalim, The Hainu ha'oris Zoh shemeir b'malchus. So it goes back to the level of Zoh that's made in Malchus. Remember, Zoh is the place where the chemdus lev, that's where the emotions are. It's not yet expressed outward. So now, actually, he's saying, frankly, I think he's bringing both interpretations here. The Alter Rebbe as Kelim, and now he's saying it's Zoh. So Zoh, that Meir in Malchus, l'tzeirach chesavus. So it's the Zoh, the Midas, which is Garmui, as it radiates in Malchus in order to create. This is already a state of mispar, because now you're dealing with numbers. The actual 10 Maimoris is already a number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that is not dveikus mamish, not because it's not connected to the source, but it focuses on the function, on the structure of it. And therefore, it's not kulei dveikus, in other words, completely encompassed about being attached to the source. It's more like we said before, that it's either Chassidus or even not just Chassidus renewal, but even when it is connected, that is not the real connection is in Iyu v'chayui chad, because that's what their role is, to be completely attached to the source, like the chief of staff, who's always in the palace, as opposed to the workers. Just another example for what I said before, the difference between the vision that's conveyed through the Oyer and the structure which is conveyed through the Kelim. So now another expression for it is bli mispar and mispar. Umakol mokim, and again a qualification, just to show you how he's back and forth to make sure it's all very thorough and perfectly explained. He says umakol mokim in the parenthesis. Nevertheless, he imohim ba'achdus gam kishe'eni imohim ba'atzilus. What does he mean? He imohim ba'achdus gam kishe'eni imohim ba'atzilus. Yeah, that's coming from a Maimer. Trying to remember the Loshnas. Okay, okay, let's talk about Malchus. So you say, so Malchus now, which is focused on the creation process, Sodom Maimoris, remember he said, Eisius v'kelim of Malchus. Always keep that in mind. When he spoke earlier, he said, the Iker Mashashayach Lemeshu B'chinas Nivdal, B'chinas Eisius v'kelim the Malchus. And the way it comes by his galus, these are the Eisius of the Sodom Maimoris. So what he's saying now, that though it's true, in relation to the higher level of Iyu v'chayuhi, the energies, the Oyer, where there's a Yichud Dveikus Mamish, this is considered not Dveikus Mamish because it's relating to existence. So he's saying, but it's still, Malchus still remains one with Imohem, meaning with the I assume he means the Chayuhi, the Eiris, which connects with the Dveikus Mamish, even when he's not, even when Malchus is not with them in Atzilus. In other words, even when Malchus descends into Biyah, to engage into existence, like in the 6 days of creation. So that's Malchus going into Biyah, not like Shabbos, when Malchus returns to its source in Atzilus. So he says, even when it's not with them in Atzilus, it still remains united with them. In other words, Malchus never separates completely. There's no severing. It's just separating in order to fulfill its mission. So in practicality, it's not Dveikus Mamish, because it's not involved right now in just being absorbed with godliness. Its focus is on the creation. Like I said, this is the shlichus. It's on a shlichus now, but it still remains always united with the higher levels of Eir. Even when it's not Natzilus, it means he imohem ba'achdus. It's like saying a shliach, even when he's on the job, doing a shlichus, wherever he may be in the world, he still remains connected and one with his mishaleach. Tigam hadibur ein nifrid. Because also dibur, even though it's words coming out of the mouth of the speaker, as we said, that is relating to existence, but like he said a number of times, at the end of the day, the dibur still remains part of you. When you stop speaking, there's no more words. It's just that your words can affect and can influence and can teach and educate and create even. But the bottom line is, it still remains part of the medaber, the dibur. So dibur is an interesting mix. Machshava is entirely connected to you. Maisa is a creation outside of you. And dibur, on one hand, it's you're speaking. On the other hand, you're speaking to another and relating to another. So dibur has both sides to it. So if you focus on the relating to another, that's nivdal, nifrad. Yatsav nifrad mimenu. It comes out of our mouths and goes outward. But if you're talking about its connection to the speaker, it's still connected because it's still his words and speaking his words. So Asara Ma'amaris Nivrael, and the Eibishter is speaking, he's saying Yehi Kia, but it's not his etzem. On the other hand, Yehi Kia is not separate from him either. It's just coming from him outward. So it's how he relates to another, basically. Just want to see one thing here. One second. Okay, 1 second. Yeah, go ahead. Anyone want to ask something?
Yeah, when it says Gam had Dibur in a nifrad, that's talking about Hashem's Dibur, right? Not human Dibur.
In human Dibur, you also have that element, an example for it at least. Because the fact of the matter is that when you stop speaking, you stop speaking. You control that. So even when you're speaking, and it's true the speaking is going outward, it still has an element that's still part of extension of who you are. And when you stop, the dibur doesn't remain on its own. There is no more words. And yet someone else can take the ideas. Obviously with the Eibush, everything is more, is in a deeper level. But even in a human being, there's a mashal, machshava, dibur, and ma'aseh, as I just explained. So Lamaila is also similar. It's just on a different level. Machshava would be the way it's in the oiris, way it's more connected to the source. Dibur is the Eibishter, as I mentioned the other day. Lav urcha de Malchus de mishtoi mila de hedyeta. God he's saying the words, Asara Ma'amaris. It's still Asara Ma'amaris of God's. Is the Eibishter's mimer, but it's a mimer, so it's already so-called removed from the very source. It's relating to another, basically. But on the other hand, it still remains connected. But as he said earlier as well, it's still not quite like the yichud of the oiris with iyu v'chayu yichad. Okay. So as I said, this is subtle. You have to keep on going back and forth to explain. On one hand, it relates to another. On the other hand, it's still connected to the source. And that's the whole point that he's addressing here. The Chassidus, the connected to the Eir HaDavik B'mkeirei. To really fully understand it, I would suggest not memorizing the ideas, but find an example that works for you. I gave 3 or 4 examples just today. The artist, the author, the speaker. These are all examples that help you. You have to find an example that you relate to, understand the example well, identify these levels in the example, and then bring it back and say, okay, which level is which? Malchus in Biyah, Malchus in Atzilus, Garmui, Chayuhi. Because as I said, there's a lot has been said here. But bottom line is, find a good example that you can fully understand. If you don't have an example you fully understand, you will not be able to remember this, because later it becomes too abstract and you can't just memorize words. It has to be understandable. That's my humble suggestion. So find any example, either ones I gave or find another one, but you have to do that. I gave the mashal with the Batzalel and Moshe Rabbeinu, and you always need both. You need Oedis and Kalim. That's what he's discussing a lot here right now. The Oedis and the Kalim. Chayui v'garmui, just a different language. We didn't get back to the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, Ayin Yesh HaNivra, which we will, but this is now the Asara Ma'amaris Nivra Elam, And then when the Eibush is, so to speak, beyond the Asarim Amoros, above them. That's why I gave the example, the weekdays, Shabbos. So find some good examples that work for you. Try to find all these levels there. Examples even in your own personal life. And that will make it a lot easier to understand. Any other questions before I continue? Okay. V'zehu sha'er mishtane b'bchinas hamalchus. And this is also, well, it doesn't say also. V'zehu, this level we're discussing now, is coming also, will explain or will help understand sha'er mishtane b'bchinas hamalchus, that the air actually changes, goes through a shift in the level of Malchus. And I was going to use the Levana that I mentioned, the moon, as an example. So what is he adding now? He's filling in the details of understanding this lower level. So till now, we were talking about dveikus. Is it connected? Is it not connected? How connected is it? So we learned it's connected, but not as much as the higher levels are connected. Briefly put. Now he's saying something more, that the Eir actually is mishtana. If you may remember in the last page when he said that it's not just the Kalim and the Oisius that are nivdal, he said these words, I just want to read them a moment. Ach kamoy kein gama Eir hamislabish bezeh hu b'chinas nivdal min ha'etzem. Remember, it's not just that the Kalim, the instruments are removed, but the Eir itself, ukamoy Eir ha'seichel abba b'Oisius hadibur. Harihim gamkein, harihu gamkein b'chinas nifrid. The seichel that's being conveyed through the letters, meaning the Eir as it's being channeled through the containers, is also nifrid, meaning a step away from the source, because it's relating to another. And that explains why the Eir v'keli of Malchus is nivdelis. So now he's saying, and this is the meaning that the Eir actually changes in Malchus. Ukamoi, and here's the new, introducing now the moon. Ukamoi Eir halavana, like the light of the moon. Shu Eir hashemesh. All it is the reflection of the light of the sun. Rak shemishtana. But it goes through a change. If you didn't know better, you would not think the moon is a reflection of the sun. They don't look alike. It's very different, it's much more pale. You can look at the moon. You can't look at the sun in its full brightness. So something changed. It's still light. It's still called Eir, but it's called Eir Alavona. And you can't make Kiddush Shalavona on the sun. You can't make Bichas Achama on the moon. So though one is a reflection, you could say, 1 second, here's a light. I put a mirror here. The mirror is reflecting this light. But a mirror, it doesn't change. At least not the way he's describing here. A levana is a fundamental change in the light itself. He doesn't elaborate here, but in other places it talks a lot more about this. He just wants to bring the point of shinui, change. V'harei eir shu b'chinas dveikus ein bei shinui klal. So this is just going to reinforce and intensify the case that it's not the same level of dveikus. Because the eir, which is completely attached to its source, would not go through change. Ein bei shinui klal. If something was davuk, you take a light and then you connect another entity to it, it becomes an extension of it. Light is not a separate entity. Yes, it's another entity, but all it is a reflection of its source. So it wouldn't show to any change. The fact that the moon, which is Malchus, the light of the moon does change. It doesn't look like the sunlight. That's due to the fact that it's not dveikus. It doesn't have that same connection and attachment. It's not just an extension. It's not just the sunlight as, let's say, it's reflected in a mirror, or the sunlight as reflected in the water, or something like that, which is really just a picture of the sun, an image of the sun. The moon, something shifts. I'm not sure how much he's going to explain about this shift, but let's read on, and if whatever he needs more explanation, I'll try to add. I'll just continue reading. So now, this, of course, adds another dimension to the whole discussion, because essentially the Oira Leki, the divine energy, as it relates to existence, it goes through some shift from the way it was in its pure form, when it was just Dovuk, just attached to its source and just reflecting its source. And we learned earlier, above, the Yesh Lemer, the Malchus, Commercial Batzilus, he bebchinis Moyer HaGodl. So though he's not posing it like a question, but he's definitely qualifying this. He says, earlier we learned the Malchus, as it's not Silus, is a Moyer HaGodl. Which means when in Biyah, Malchus is a Moyer HaKotten. But in Atzilus, it's a Moyer HaGodl. So he answers, if you want to put it in a question, he doesn't say it as a question answer, but he explains, V'hainu b'chinas pnimius ha-Malchus. Pnimius of Malchus retains an element of Moyer HaGodl. Remember, the Pasuk says, in the Yom Revi, fourth day of creation, the Eibishter says, Yehi me'eres hagdelim. First it starts that both are me'eres, Loshen Rabim, plural, because the Eibishter created two great luminaries. And then afterwards it says, Hamoyer HaGodl, Hamoyer HaKotten, the great luminary and the small luminary. So that's where the Gemara bases on that. From there we learn that the moon went through a diminishment. Because why does it say here there were two great luminaries? And then suddenly says one is great, one is small. So there's the whole story that the moon came and complained. So God ultimately diminished the moon. And that's why the moon goes through phases and all the diminishment of the moon. So basically he's saying, Pnimius HaMalchus retains still that element of Moyer HaGodl that the Levana was once, or still is in Pnimius. Aval Chetzenius HaMalchus. But the outer dimension of Malchus, Shenasamoka Biyah, that becomes a source for Biyah, B'ri Yitzir Asiyah, Harizeh B'chinas Moyer HaKotten. This is the level of the small luminary. So the Rebbe Rashab is simply qualifying and saying what I just said, that it's not Dveikus, and it goes through a change, it's Chetzenius HaMalchus. And Pnimius HaMalchus, Moyer HaGodl. Now, does he mean it doesn't go through a change? Was the moon exactly like the sun? There were like two suns in the sky? Or there were two different, but Pashtas, the moon was not a reflection of the sun, it was its own light. But there's many different explanations for this, which is not really the scope of our discussion. What was there before? When you say, was the moon not a reflection of the sun? Was it a completely different entity? Or it was a perfect reflection, meaning just as strong as the sun was? So most likely it's the first, but nevertheless, relevant to our discussion here, what he wants to say is that the light goes through a change in the reflection of the moon, and that's because it's not total dveikus, and yet there's a Pnimius HaMalchus that's still called Moyer HaGodl. And then, of course, what we're discussing more relates to Chetzenius HaMalchus, Moyer HaKotten. But for more information on this, you need to look at another Maimon. There's a whole actually from Isaac Humler, a sefer called Shnei Me'eres Hagdelim, and he discusses this at length, all the different opinions about the two luminaries, what they were like, what happened after the diminishment, what will happen when Mashiach comes. Then it says 7 times stronger. So there's a lot of discussion on this in Chassidus. If you also look in Sefer Al-Kutim in La'asid Love, the Erech, the entry on La'asid Love, there's a whole section there about what will happen with the Me'eres Hagdelim and the shifts they went through. So just if you're interested in this topic, not relevant, obviously, more than what the Rebbe Rashab qualifies here in this parentheses. Okay. So now going back to the flow here. And our being, and due to the fact that this reflection, in Malchus we're talking, in the moon, is not in a state of dveikus. I know you could say, didn't he say before there is some dveikus? He means not dveikus mamish like the higher levels. That's essentially what he's saying. It's not in a form of dveikus. Like, for example, the moon is not attached to the sun. It's a reflection of the sun and dependent on it. But it's changed, so it's a different state. Im kain, I'm sorry, Aval, one second, where are we? Im kain mashanikra ayin. Now he's going back. So therefore, what is called ayin, ayin mamish. When we call it ayin, since it's not in the form of dveikus, we can't call it ayin mamish, meaning that it's completely nullified in the presence of its source. The four different levels of the ayin of the yesh amiti. You can't say this on an that's not davuk, or on the ayin that on this level of in Malchus that relates to creation. You can't call this ayin of the Yesh HaNivra ayin mamish. So why do we call it ayin? So he's bringing this now back to our discussion that we've been having. So why do we call it ayin? Because ayin is coming to tell you it's not yesh. It's not begeder dover. What's the word? The Rabbi used the besug mitzias of the yesh. Here he uses the word loy dover, the gab mitzias yesh. It's not existent compared to mitzias yesh. Just ask any, or ask the scientists that deny the divine energy, because the divine energy is not made of the same substance. It's not in the same reality, like we discussed with the fishermen and the other examples. So if you say, for example, you have water in a cup, that water came from a faucet, which came from a reservoir, which came from the rain or whatever, there you identify clearly the source of something. So one thing is a mocker to another. Where can you create such a evident and tangible source between the yesh and the ayin? No. Someone says to you, so tell me what this ayin is like. You'll say, I don't know. I just know it's the divine energy within existence. But compared to our existence, you can't call it existent. So that's why we call it ayin, like nothing. Not like nothing that it doesn't exist, and that doesn't exist like our existence exists. That's what he's saying here. Actually, I'm just thinking whether I should read one more line. I actually think we should stop here, because he's now going to explain this ayin in more detail and bring it back to das elyon and das tachten. As you see, he's already winding down here. The end of the mimer will be at the bottom of this page, the next page. So this mimer that we've gone through many classes, close to 50 classes just on this mimer. We're coming closer to, not over yet. I want to see the Frierdiker Rebbe's description of this class. Yeah, this mimer 138 says, Ayin anechlik nikra das elyon v'ayin al shem shein musuk. Okay, let me just stop here. So we're close to the top of page 1160, and we're going to continue. He's going to bring it back to the ayin. So last line we've touched upon here is that the ayin is not called ayin because it's not dveikus to the source. There, it's completely nullified. That's all it is. Its whole role is to be reflective of its source. Here, its role is to create, and therefore goes through a shift. Mishtana, like he says. It's not, dveikus is not quite like it is the higher level. So if it's not such dveikus, the reason you call it ayin is not because it's completely nullified. Calling it ayin because from our perspective, in other words, this ayin is in relation to us. The first ayin is in relation to its source. We said ayin yesh amiti, as the source looks at the ayin, it's completely nullified, and the ayin also feels completely nullified with all the different levels we discussed. Here, we're looking from the bottom up. The Yesh is trying to figure out who put us here. Ma'ayin basa. Ma'ayin. From where did we come? And what we come to discover, it's something that's mysterious, that we cannot relate to because it's not a Metzias Dover in our reality. So the lack of Dveikus creates a different type of definition of Ayin. And he's going to explain this Ayin obviously is the perfect one to relate to our existence, because on one hand it remains elusive. On the other hand, he's going to explain it is associating with existence. That's its role. So it's going to be, again, a dance here of two different back and forth. So the lack of Dveikus creates the ability for number one to be creation, because I'm just adding a point that he doesn't say right here, that if it was completely attached to its source, it'd be so intense and bright, it would not allow existence to come to emerge. So that's the first thing that happens with Dveikus. And it also, at the same time, causes it to be, it's not completely nullified. So it remains elusive. Okay, we'll talk about this more tomorrow in detail. We'll stop here, 11:60.